The desert wind howled like it had a voice, shrieking across the dry flats in the middle of January, ripping through the gullies and rattling the twisted Joshua trees with a kind of desperate fury. That wind didn't care for human schedules. It didn't care that the wagon broke 2 miles back. It didn't care that 3 children sat huddled beneath a buffalo hide, lips blue, waiting for their mother to dig again. And she was digging. Eliza Kane's palms were raw from it, her fingernails broken, and her breath came in shallow gasps as she chipped away at the packed desert slope with the head of an old hoe. Her fingers bled into the sand, leaving pink smears on every stone she pried loose. But she didn't stop, couldn't. Her dead husband's voice still echoed behind her ribs. They'll never make it without shelter, Lizzie. You know that. The children didn't cry anymore. They'd stopped 2 days ago, when their food ran out and the skin around their eyes went dry. Maddie, the youngest, had taken to sleeping nearly all day. Eli, the oldest at just 10, hadn't spoken since they lost the mule. Only middle child Joseph still asked questions, like why they couldn't just go to town. Eliza didn't have the heart to tell him that town was 3 days back, and forward was nothing but gravel and sun. She had already passed the rusted post where that German settler, Koch, had died standing up in the sand during the spring drought. That meant there was no going back now. They were deeper than most dared, which meant she either made the earth herself open, or they died on top of it. But Eliza wasn't the type to lie down. She struck again, harder this time, sending a crack through the dry stone, just enough to wedge the hoe in and pull. A chunk came loose. The sun blinked through a narrow slit in the rock, and behind it, for the first time in a day and a half of digging, there was cool blackness. She leaned her shoulder into the wall and pushed. The mouth of a shallow cave gave way. It wasn't deep, not yet, but it was enough to shield the wind, enough to get them inside. "Elijah," she rasped, turning her cracked lips to the boy. "Bring Maddie. Joe, grab that hide." She didn't wait to see if they obeyed. She was already crawling in. 4 weeks before, when Eliza had first appeared in Fort Holt with a half-loaded wagon and a letter from her husband's old friend, folks had stared. She was dusty, wind-burnt, and heavily veiled, not because she was hiding her grief, though she surely had plenty, but because the desert had already taught her one thing. It didn't like pride. Show off your smooth skin, and it'd burn it off. Show off your riches, and it'd bury them. And show up saying you wanted to build a home in the open flats south of Holt. That got you laughed out of the general store. "Woman, you build out there. You'll be picking sand out your ears till the vultures take you," old Mr. Fenner spat, rocking back in his crate and chewing his tobacco slower. "Ain't even shade out there, let alone water." But Eliza hadn't come to Fort Holt for advice. She'd come for wood, tin, nails and rope, and the scrap metal nobody else wanted. The kind that turned red with rust and sang when the wind whistled over it. The kind that weighed heavy but wouldn't crack under cold. She bought all of it, strapped it to her wagon, said nothing when the man at the livery warned her again. "It gets colder in the desert than up here. Folks don't believe that until they wake up frozen." Eliza knew. She'd buried her husband after a freeze back in Kansas that killed half their cattle and cracked the sod house apart like an egg. She'd wrapped his body in calico and buried him near the creek, then sat under the stars for 3 nights, listening to the wind. It wasn't grief that settled her mind. It was something else. It was determination. Back in the cave, Eliza started the fire with the last of their kindling, using twigs, lint, and bits of her own hair twisted into a ball. The smoke curled into the crags of the roof, then drifted out harmlessly. The children pressed against her as warmth finally touched their skin. Maddie moaned in her sleep, and Eliza ran fingers through her hair. But warmth alone wasn't enough. They needed walls. They needed protection. That night she unrolled her bundle of salvaged metal sheets. They'd been heavy, dragging the wagon axle low, but now she saw them for what they were, a shell. She lined them into the stone like ribs, nailed their edges into holes she carved with a hammerstone, placed them against the windward curve of the cave so when the next storm came, it would roll over the metal and skip like a stone. She used the wagon bed as a door, bracing it upright against the opening. Inside, she stacked rocks, sealed cracks with mud, and used scraps of fabric to plug the roof's holes. By morning, the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. But inside her makeshift den, her children breathed easily. By the second week, the storm came. It was a bluster of black clouds and hard sleet, driven sideways by the same howling wind the desert was known for. Lightning struck in the distance, close enough to smell the static, and sand rose in curtains across the flats. The Kane cabin, if you could call it that, was nearly invisible now, half buried under a drift of red earth and built so snug into the stone wall that it looked like a natural crack. Inside, Eliza held the fire steady using dried tumbleweed, sagebrush, and bits of cloth. They had no chimney, only a smoke vent she carved in the back. The heat didn't escape much, and that was the key. Out there, every settler's cabin, wooden and proud, shook on its posts. Even Holt itself huddled down, its plank walls rattling like teeth. The storm hit them with ice and sand, blew into every seam and under every roof. No fire held, but down in the crack, wrapped in canvas and tin, the Kane children slept warm. They wouldn't be forgotten, of course. 3 days into the storm, when it looked like half the valley might be swept clean, old Fenner sent a search party. "Check if that fool widow's froze out there," he barked. They didn't expect to find much. They certainly didn't expect to see a narrow path of stones leading to a carved door of wagon wood, braced with thick red sandbags. They didn't expect to hear a baby laughing on the other side of the wind. And when Eliza opened the door, hair wild, hands calloused, eyes sharp, they stood frozen, blinking at the warmth that poured from behind her. "You bring anything worth trading?" she asked. The storm lasted 6 days. Not wind and sand alone. Those the desert delivered freely almost year-round, but true cold. Cold that sliced under your clothes like knives. Cold that pried at your teeth. Cold that made the men in Holt huddle like cattle in the blacksmith's barn, because the floorboards in their own cabins had frozen through. Fires refused to catch in the chimneys. Smoke just rolled back down and out into the rooms, choking whoever tried to sleep. Ice formed inside teapots. One baby went blue in his crib before his mother even realized the fire was out. And yet, in a rock-faced slot 3 miles south of town, where the storm hit hardest and the ground had turned to frozen ridges of rust-colored shale, the one fire that stayed lit was Eliza Kane's. Not that she told anyone that. She only opened the door when it was safe to do so, when the wind wasn't driving sand like bullets against the face of the cliff. And even then, she only let it crack wide enough to dump out waste or bring in snow for melting. That snow, grey as it was, turned to water quickly when placed in the clay pot she'd buried into the hearth. She rationed heat like food. She told the children to gather tight and stay still. She taught them how to cover the warmest places with blankets, not themselves, but the stones near the fire, to preserve the heat for hours. She built baffles inside the den using salvaged wagon slats so the heat couldn't rise and escape in one quick burst. It lingered, pooling low near the ground where her children slept. They called it the womb room. They called her the Cliff Mother. It wasn't a joke, not among themselves. When the storm finally gave up its siege and the sun rose bleary and pale above the cracked horizon, Holt emerged like a whipped dog. Fence posts had snapped clean. Window shutters were buried in snowdrifts that had no business forming in a desert. 2 families were missing. One came stumbling in from the East Hills, faces raw, carrying their youngest wrapped in a feed sack. The town held its breath as word came back from the men Fenner had sent. "She's alive," they said in disbelief. "All 4 of them. She built into the rocks, like a damn fox or something." Fenner had stared, jaw slack. "That woman built where?" "Right into the cliffside. Got metal plates and canvas lining it. We stepped inside for a moment. You can feel it. Warmer than any of our places." Fenner spat, but said nothing. He'd warned her, hadn't he? He wasn't about to admit he'd been wrong. But others began to murmur, especially the women. They knew what it was to huddle around embers that wouldn't burn hot enough. They knew what it was to fear nightfall. "She did it alone?" they asked. "With children?" No one answered. But they all looked the same direction, south. Eliza didn't leave the den for 2 more days. The children were warm now, but their bodies were weak. Joseph's cough had gone deep in his chest, and Maddie still didn't eat much, unless coaxed with a lullaby and a warm cloth. Eliza took to foraging when the sun stayed up long enough to soften the ground. She found barrel cactus near the dry creek bed and cracked them open for water. She fished beetles from under stones. She made soup out of acorns and a little bacon rind she'd saved since Kansas. And she made a decision. She wasn't going back to Holt, not unless she had to. That town had no love for widows, and even less for women who knew how to build without a man standing over them. No, she'd stay here, make something that lasted. By the 2nd week of January, Holt saw its first wagon train since the storm, a shipment of lumber from Bear Hook, along with tools, flour, and medicine. But what caught the town's attention wasn't the goods. It was the 3 travelers riding ahead of the wagon, the Leffers family. They'd been gone since November, thought dead. "We came from the pass," the father, Walter Leffers, said. "Froze 2 nights. Would have died for sure if not for the woman." "What woman?" the storekeeper asked. "She had a fire in the rocks. Pulled our boy in first, then let us crawl inside after. Said she'd built it all herself. Told us to rest. Gave us soup." Fenner, who'd overheard from across the street, narrowed his eyes. "What did she look like?" he barked. "Veiled," Leffers said, "but strong hands. long braids, had a little girl sleeping against her chest the whole time. It didn't take much guessing. Holt's women looked at each other, then toward the southern cliffs again. That night, 3 mothers gathered what they could: extra flour, dried apples, tallow candles, and baby clothes, and headed south with shawls over their heads. They didn't knock. There wasn't a door to knock on, just a braced wall of wagon planks reinforced with stone and canvas. But Eliza heard them coming, crunching over the frozen wash. She opened the door before they reached the last bend. One woman gasped softly. "You're in the wall?" Eliza didn't speak, just nodded once and stood aside. They stepped into the warmth, blinking like they couldn't believe it. Maddie peeked out from behind the fire shelf. Joseph lay sleeping, wrapped in a quilt, and Eli stood at the far end, stacking small stones into a chimney baffle. "You made this?" Eliza's voice was rough. "Didn't have a choice." The women didn't answer at first. They just stood, letting the warmth soak into their bones. Then one of them, a younger mother with a tight braid and scars on her wrists, reached into her sack and pulled out a wrapped parcel. "Take it," she said. "We owe you." Eliza took it. Inside were beans, a little rice, and a pouch of lye soap. Not much, but it meant something. Over the next month, others came, not just for help, but for advice. They brought scraps of tin and asked how she'd shaped them. They asked where she'd found the stones flat enough to build into. They asked how she'd kept the fire vent from choking. Eliza told them. Sometimes, if she liked their tone. Sometimes she didn't speak at all, just stepped outside, pointed at a rock, or traced her boot in the dust. But the ones who paid attention learned, and those who didn't froze half to death trying to copy her. That spring, 5 new cabins went up along the edge of the same cliff line. Not wood cabins, not sod, not the proud upright things of the prairie, but low-slung, partially dug, wind-slick cabins with fire baffles and layered stone walls buried into the rock like they'd grown there. They called it South Hollow, and Eliza's home was the first. That summer brought heat like a furnace. But inside the cliff homes, it was cooler than under canvas, cooler than in Holt, and not once did a child fall sick from dust exposure. The babies slept longer. The mothers gathered and began bartering again. One man, who had refused to speak to Eliza all winter, asked her to help him build a hatch for his root cellar. She showed him how to shape the hinge using bent metal. He didn't say thank you, but he left a sack of potatoes at her door that night. One day, weeks later, a girl from Holt came running barefoot into South Hollow, red-faced and sobbing. "Bandits!" she cried. "3 of them took the blacksmith's wife. Said they're coming back. Said they want food and coin." Panic spread quick. Holt had no real sheriff, just a few aging veterans who'd lost their nerve. The men of South Hollow looked at each other, then at Eliza. It wasn't said aloud, but somehow the decision was clear. They followed her lead. Eliza loaded her father's revolver, wrapped her children in wool, and sent them into the deepest part of the den. Then she stepped into the sun, tied her veil back, and waited at the edge of the hollow with a half-dozen others who'd seen her fight the desert and win. They didn't have to shoot. The bandits came, saw the cliff homes, saw the way the settlers stood, not proud but sure, and turned back without a word. That night, someone carved a word into the stone near her cabin, above the smoke vent where the soot stained black Kane's wall. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't a name given in mockery either. And for the first time since Kansas, Eliza Kane let herself cry. Spring in the desert didn't arrive with flower blossoms or birdsong. It came quietly, without drama, just a lightening of the sky before dawn, a slight softness to the wind, and the disappearance of frost from the hollows. It wasn't warm, not yet, but it was no longer deadly. And in South Hollow, the mood changed with it. Children emerged from their dens barefoot, blinking in the light like animals stirred from hibernation. Men returned to their tools. Women took to hauling water from the old wash, which now ran shallow but steady from snowmelt in the north. They no longer needed to barter warmth for survival, but they had not forgotten who had taught them how to trap it. Eliza Kane became something strange that season. Not a matron, not a leader, not quite a saint, but a landmark. Strangers passing through Holt heard her name spoken with equal parts reverence and uncertainty. Not everyone liked the way she refused town meetings or how she didn't kneel at church, but no one denied her usefulness. In a land where most settlers still thought like city folk, build up, stand tall, ride forward, Eliza had done the opposite. She'd dug in. The earth was her ally, and that unsettled people. "I don't trust a woman who keeps to caves," Fenner said one day, rocking back in his chair outside the dry goods store. Ain't natural, but people didn't listen to Fenner so much anymore, not after what happened during the second freeze. It had struck without warning. 3 nights of bitter cold, with sleet and a north wind that carried grit so sharp it sanded the paint off buildings. Holt's windmills froze. The water tower cracked. Pipes burst. A few folks tried burning fence posts to keep their homes heated, but it wasn't enough. South Hollow, however, lit their fires low and steady. The cliff homes held the warmth like baked stone. Even with sleet lashing the outer walls, the insides stayed snug. Eliza's own den barely dipped below 60 degrees. This time she didn't wait for Holt to come crawling. She gathered 3 of the stronger men, 2 of whom she'd taught to build their own baffles, and they hitched mules to sleds and rode north. They brought stew, cloth, heat bricks wrapped in waxed hide. The people of Holt, pale and stiff-fingered, wept as they were fed. One woman clutched Eliza's coat sleeve and sobbed. "Why are you helping us?" she asked. "After all they said?" Eliza didn't answer. She simply pressed a warm brick into the woman's hands and turned back into the snow. That spring, South Hollow grew. More families arrived, some drawn by rumor, others by desperation. A second line of dwellings rose farther along the ridge, built in the same shallow dug, cliff-bound style. Some even began using clay bricks shaped from the mud near the seasonal creek. It was ugly work and slow, but the walls it built could hold a fire's heat all night. They started calling these cane walls. Eliza didn't approve. "This ain't about me," she told one of the younger women, Sarah Oates, who had carved the name into her lintel beam. "It's about survival." Sarah just smiled. "Well, survival's what you gave us." Eliza didn't argue again, but she scraped the letters off. One morning in late April, as the temperature climbed and cactus began to bloom in red bursts across the flats, a government rider appeared. His horse was gaunt, his boots were Eastern, and his coat still bore a military stamp, likely surplus. He rode with the stiff posture of a man who hadn't lived through winter the way the settlers had. "Eliza Kane?" he asked, holding up a sheaf of paper. She stepped out of her cabin slowly, arms crossed. "I'm from the district land office," he said. "I've been told you're building dwellings in unclaimed territory. You do realize that without title or deed, all this belongs to the government?" Eliza didn't flinch. "And what's the government done to earn it?" The man's face twitched, but he didn't answer. He held out the paper again. "I need you to appear in Holt next week. There's to be a hearing." South Hollow watched silently as the rider turned his horse and galloped off. The hearing was held in the church hall, which served as town center when the preacher wasn't holding service. Eliza entered wearing her wide-brim hat and dust-smeared shawl. Her children stayed back at the den, guarded by half the women in the hollow. She didn't need them to see her defend what was already hers. Inside the hall, she stood alone. The magistrate, brought in from Las Cruces, read from the paper with the dispassion of a man auditing wheat barrels. "A total of 16 semi-permanent dwellings established on federal land, no records of purchase, no approved settlement claims. This constitutes a violation of—" "Where was the government during the freeze?" Eliza asked, cutting him off. He blinked. "Ma'am, that is not relevant. Where were you when children turned blue? When the town tower cracked? When half of Holt warmed themselves with fence posts?" The room stirred. Fenner grunted in annoyance, but others, mothers especially, leaned forward. "This land was empty," Eliza said. "Abandoned, rock and wind and death. We made it livable. We bled into the stone to make it hold fire. You did not file the proper—" "No, we didn't, because there was no one to file to." The magistrate tapped his papers, clearly uncomfortable. "Regardless, these dwellings fall under bureau jurisdiction. They may be seized, or fines may be—" "Then come seize them," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried, and in that moment, it held more weight than the law ever could. No one came forward. Not the sheriff, not the town's men, not the magistrate. He looked down again. "There may be another solution, homesteading exemptions, but the paperwork must be filed immediately, with descriptions of each dwelling." Eliza nodded once. "You'll have them by sundown." That night, by firelight, Eliza wrote 16 descriptions on old feed sacks and the backs of grocery lists. She detailed every home built into the ridge, listed names, outlined structure, depth, construction methods. She called the cliff line Kane's Reach, not because she liked the sound of it, but because that's what people were already calling it in Holt. The magistrate returned the next morning. She handed him the bundle. "You should know," he said carefully, folding the papers. "They'll try to tax this, if not now, later. These aren't normal homes." Eliza squinted at the horizon. "Neither is this land." Summer came hard, heat like a blacksmith's breath. Cracks opened in the ground, wide enough to swallow a dog. Snakes came down from the hills, hunting for shade. South Hollow had no trees, so the settlers hung cloth awnings and poured water on the walls of their cabins to cool them. It worked, just enough. One morning, Maddie cried out from the back room, a scorpion in her bedroll. Eliza killed it with a flat rock, then spent the afternoon sealing the floor with packed mud and burnt sand. That night, she sat on the threshold, watching the heat shimmer off the horizon. Joseph came and leaned against her. "Are we going to stay here forever?" Eliza didn't answer right away. The desert didn't believe in forever. But it had taught her this. Nothing soft survived, and nothing permanent was built quickly. "We'll stay long enough," she said. That August, thunder rolled over the mesa like cannon fire. Rain came in wild bursts, sudden and violent. Flash floods carved new channels through the flats. One man's sod cabin, built too close to the wash, collapsed in seconds. A girl drowned trying to save her dog, but South Hollow stayed firm. The cliff homes, dug high into the ridge, watched from above as the water raced by beneath them. For the first time, Holt sent word before a crisis hit. They needed help. Eliza rode up with 4 men and a wagon full of stones, tin sheets, and clay. She taught them how to build a chimney that didn't leak, how to vent heat but not let in wind, how to brace the roof against sideways rain. One of the women handed her a flask and whispered, "You saved my niece." Eliza didn't drink, but she held the flask in both hands and nodded. That fall, when the desert cooled again, and the light grew golden, a government letter arrived. It was short, dry, official. The Bureau acknowledged the Kane settlement as a recognized frontier village under the Homestead Act. "Per your filings and community establishment," it read, "you are hereby designated as the founding settler and primary claimant of Kane's Reach." It was the first time Eliza saw her name in ink. She folded the paper slowly, placed it in the same trunk where she kept her wedding ring, and returned to the fire, where her children were carving dolls from dry roots. They still came to her, even after the land was claimed, even after the storm stories faded into folktale, even after Holt finally built a stone town hall and the general store painted over its cracked window with a new coat of green. They came for advice, for help, for warmth. Not always in winter, not always when desperate, sometimes just to listen, because Eliza Kane had done what no one else thought to try. She made the desert feel like home. The second winter came in like a blade, no warning, no drawn-out chill creeping in through the corners. One day it was dusty and dry, with children kicking sand under a washed-out sky, and the next, the wind screamed down from the high cliffs, like it had unfinished business with everyone still breathing in the desert. But South Hollow was ready. Eliza Kane stood atop her den, cloak snapping in the wind, eyes narrowed against the grit. The town below, still Holt, still proud, had added another row of buildings over the past year, and the new ones were better built, stone-faced, steel-fastened. But none were dug into the land like hers, none bent with the wind. They fought it, and the desert punished fighters. That night the temperature plunged. South Hollow's chimneys smoked low and steady, almost invisible in the dark. Inside Eliza's home, the children slept curled on warm stone, the heat bricks glowing softly. Maddie clutched her doll made of rope and twine. Joseph had grown stronger and taller, and he now handled the fire like a second heart, feeding it with just enough to last, never more. Eli took watch near the hatch, wrapped in his father's old coat. He was 11 now, and said less with each month, his eyes darker, more like Eliza's with every passing storm. She taught them to measure warmth like coin, to bank heat the way other families banked flour, when to speak, when to listen to the wind, when to hide, when to work, and when to dig. By now they were desert folk, not by birth, but by bone. 2 days into the freeze, trouble rode in from the east. Not bandits this time, not claim jumpers or cattlemen. It was a single rider, slumped and near dead, clutching the reins of a half-dead horse. No one recognized the man, not at first. His beard was caked in ice. His skin had gone the color of riverstone. They dragged him from the saddle outside the edge of South Hollow and brought him to Eliza's fire. She leaned over him, frowning. He stank of blood and sulfur. His eyes fluttered. "Kane?" he rasped. She stared. "Who told you my name?" But the man didn't answer. His breath hitched and then stopped. They buried him at the mouth of the hollow, the earth too frozen to dig far, just a shallow trench filled with stones and smoke root to keep scavengers away. No one knew who he was, but his saddle had something strange. A seal branded into the leather, the kind Eliza hadn't seen since Kansas. A railway company's mark. Below it, a charcoal sketch of Eliza Kane, rough-jawed and veiled, standing before a dugout house with smoke curling behind her. She hadn't posed for it, but the image told enough truth to stir something. Days later, another rider came, then another. Journalists, sketch artists, reporters. They all wanted to see the miracle in the rock, wanted to speak to the widow architect. Eliza refused most interviews, but she let them tour, let them feel the heat trapped inside a den warmed by stone, let them see the children running barefoot through an underground corridor built with no money, only desperation and hands. And the headlines changed. Rail threatens frontier ingenuity. Mothers build stronger than men. Chicago investors face backlash for desert eviction. The Bureau blinked, then stalled, then withdrew. A letter came weeks later, stamped, sealed, curt. All claims previously filed under the name Tilden Railway Company have been vacated under Clause 24C of the revised Homestead Precedents Act. The land was theirs, permanently. That night, Eliza Kane lit a fire at the highest ridge and stood beside it. One by one, others joined. From the dens, from the tunnels, from the dark folds of South Hollow, children danced, mothers wept, fathers held each other like soldiers home from war. She didn't give a speech. She simply stood, watching the sparks rise, because she knew the truth. The desert never gives anything for free. But if you dig deep enough, bend when others break, and stay warm when others freeze, you don't just survive, you own it. The map makers had no word for it. When the next round of surveyors came through, years later, long after the railroad gave up on carving through the cliffs, they marked the area simply Kane's Reach. Some thought it was a natural formation, others called it an unusual canyon settlement. A few noted the strategic fire baffles and thermal traps, and guessed it had been some kind of military outpost. But none of them really understood how it had come to be, because none of them had lived through those winters, or felt the heat of a stone wall in a blizzard, or watched a widow hammer tin into a hearth with a split palm and a dead stare. But those who lived there remembered. They remembered everything, and Eliza Kane had not vanished into legend. She had simply continued. 5 years passed. South Hollow was now a village in full, with 28 dwellings, a shared well system, 3 communal hearth tunnels, and a gathering circle they'd hollowed from the natural bend in the cliffs. Children were born into the stone now, not just dragged into it. They didn't ask why their walls were rounded or why chimneys didn't rise high above roofs. They didn't ask why doors faced inward. It was simply the way it was, the way it had always been in their eyes. Even the folks in Holt came to admit it. Traders started bringing their goods south to the Hollow first, not the other way around. When a preacher tried to condemn the place as ungodly, his own congregation walked out mid-sermon and offered to help dig the first schoolroom inside the rock. Eliza hadn't asked for any of this, but she didn't turn it away. She watched her children grow. Maddie learned to weave and became the first to craft rugs from tumbleweed fiber and dyed wool. Joseph built stoves now, better than hers. He was 15 and had taken over fire maintenance for 3 of the Hollow's homes. And Eli, quiet, tall and narrow-eyed, taught the younger boys how to shape airflow using only brick and instinct. He rarely spoke, but when he did, people listened. The Kane family had become the spine of the Hollow, but they had not forgotten the beginning. One morning, as the sun crept over the cliffs, in a soft amber haze, Eliza walked the length of the chain, the interconnected passageway linking 10 of the den homes. The stones were warm underfoot, even before the fires were stoked. She paused to tighten a canvas seam, to feel the air pressure between baffles. Everything still held. She emerged at the far end of the village and looked out across the desert. A faint dust cloud curled on the horizon. Another wagon. The settlers in South Hollow took turns watching the pass now. It wasn't formal, no guns, no patrols, but they knew when someone came near. The land whispered it. That day, a stranger arrived, a young woman in a travel-stained cloak, pulling a cart stacked with barrels, books, and odd tools. She introduced herself simply, Junior Bell, from Oregon, heard there was a place here, built into the stone, came to see it. Eliza studied her, alone, strong-shouldered, eyes sharp, no ring on her hand. One of her boots was mended 3 times over. Why? Eliza asked. Junior shrugged. I don't like walls that burn. I don't like roofs that lift off in storms. I want to build something that can't be taken. Eliza stepped aside. Then you're in the right place. That night, around the communal fire, Junior asked the question others had asked before. Why'd you start it? Why not just take the wagon and keep moving when things got bad? Eliza stared into the flame. The fire reflected in her eyes, but not like light, more like memory. I didn't want my children to learn how to flee, she said. I wanted them to learn how to endure. I wanted them to feel what it means to take something harsh and make it hold life, even if that life's small, even if it's quiet. I wanted them to know that warmth can be made, that nothing's permanent, but if you build it right, it doesn't have to fall when the wind changes. Junior said nothing for a while, then nodded. I'll start digging tomorrow. By the 3rd year of peace, there was a road, not a paved one, not tracked by any agency, but a worn path, pressed by dozens of wagons, riders, and carts heading towards South Hollow. The traders came first, then builders, then artists, drawn by the stories of heat and wind and stone. Some brought gifts. One woman arrived with a printing press packed into 4 crates and declared she was starting a newsletter. Another brought glass panes scavenged from an abandoned depot and helped install sun traps in 3 homes. Someone else brought chickens. They took to the rocks easily, and still Eliza Kane remained where she'd started, at the center of it all, though she asked for no title and took no coin. They offered to name the village after her officially. She refused. Call it warmth, she said, and they did. But time does not stop, not even for the stubborn. One night, during a sandstorm that sounded like claws against the sky, Eliza sat near the old fire pit with Joseph and Maddie, now grown. Eli was outside, inspecting the vent seals with a team of younger men. Maddie was spinning cordage with quick, clever fingers. Joseph was oiling a set of iron hinges for the next tunnel door. They weren't talking. They rarely needed to. But suddenly, Joseph looked up. "Do you ever think of leaving?" he asked quietly. Eliza looked at him, then at the fire. "No," she said. Maddie smiled. "Not even for a green place? For rivers?" "I had rivers," Eliza said. "They don't keep you warm when the storms come." Then, after a pause, "This place is mine, not because I own it, because I built it. Every inch, every splinter, every burn on my palm is part of this stone now." Joseph nodded. "So when you're gone," Eliza interrupted, gently but firm, "I won't be gone. Not really. As long as this place holds fire, I'm here." The winter of the third year came without violence. No blizzards, no rail threats, just cold, quiet, constant. The people of Warmth weathered it easily. By now, every home had a vent. Every child knew how to bank a fire. Heat was traded like coin. Warmth had grown into something permanent, not despite the desert, but with it. And then, one dawn, Eliza Kane didn't rise. She lay in her cot, arms folded, eyes closed, peaceful, as if she'd simply merged with the stone around her. Joseph found her. He didn't cry. Eli did quietly. Maddie stood in silence, clutching her mother's shawl. They buried her not in a marked grave, but within the wall of her own den, sealed with polished stones, smoothed by years of touch, a final warmth held inside a shell of earth and will. The people came from Holt, from Santa Fe, from farther still. No sermon was given, just silence. And the wind. Years passed. Warmth remained. The den was never torn down, never repurposed. They turned it into a kind of shrine, not for worship, but for remembrance. Children were brought there in storms, told to sit and listen. They said you could still feel her fire, trapped in the stone. Some claimed to hear her voice, in the wind, teaching the rocks how to hold heat. Others said that was just stories. But either way, when a new settler arrived with calloused hands and fear in their eyes and asked how to survive in the desert, they were told only one thing: start by digging.